Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're watching or listening. My name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law to bring you a lot of information that plenty of bad folks would rather you not have. Today's lecture, ladies and gentlemen, will provide another installment into our series on the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where we go into depth, really exploring the true beliefs of the very historically notable U.S. figure named Mr. Abraham Lincoln. So that way when we go about maybe supporting or claiming to support his ideas, we truly understand exactly what he was advocating and not mischaracterizing his ideas, his proposals, and the government that he left at the end or even at the wake of his administration. So let's go ahead and jump on over to the transcripts of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. We are going on to the fifth one. If you haven't gone back and watched 1 through 4, I highly encourage you to do so because there are quite a few tidbits already that have exposed what Mr. Lincoln believed that are contrary to the record, the historical record, at least the ones taught in government schools, as to what he supposedly believed. So number 5. Since Mr. Lincoln started last debate, Mr. Douglas will be starting this one. It took place in Galesburg on October 7th, 1858. Mr. Douglas says this: Ladies and gentlemen, 4 years ago I appeared before the people of Knox County for the purpose of defending my political action upon the compromise measures of 1850 and the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Bill. Those of you before me who were present then will remember that I vindicated myself for supporting those two measures by the fact that they rested upon the great fundamental principle that the people of each state and each territory of this Union have the right and ought to be permitted to exercise the right of regulating their own domestic concerns in their own way, subject to no other limitation or restriction than that which the Constitution of the United States imposes upon them. I then called upon the people of Illinois to decide whether that principle of self-government was right or wrong. If it was right, and is right, then the compromise measures of 1850 were right, and consequently the Kansas and Nebraska bill, based upon the same principle, must necessarily have been right. A heckler shouts out, "Good for Lincoln." To this, Mr. Douglas replies, "Fellow citizens, here you find me hurraying for Lincoln, and saying that he did right when in one part of the state he stood up for Negro equality, and in another part, for political effect, discarded the doctrine, and declared that there always must be a superior and inferior race. Abolitionists up north were expected and required to vote for Lincoln, because he goes for the equality of the races, holding that by the Declaration of Independence the white man and the Negro were created equal and endowed by the divine law with that equality. And down south he tells the old Whigs, the Kentuckians, Virginians, and Tennesseans that there is a physical difference in the races, making one superior and the other inferior, and that he is in favor of maintaining the superiority of the white race over the Negro. Now, how can you reconcile those two positions of Mr. Lincoln? He is to be voted for in the South as a pro-slavery man, and he is to be voted for in the North as an abolitionist. Up here, he thinks it is all nonsense to talk about a difference between the races, and says that we must, quote, discard all quibbling about this race and the other race being inferior, and therefore they must be placed in an inferior position. Down south, he makes this quibble about this race and the other race being inferior as the creed of his party, and declares that the Negro can never be elevated to the position of the white man. I tell you that this Chicago doctrine of Lincoln's, declaring that the Negro and the white man are made equal by the Declaration of Independence and by divine providence, is a monstrous heresy. The signers of the Declaration of Independence never dreamed of the Negro when they were writing that document. They referred to white men, to men of European birth and European descent, when they declared the equality of all men. I see a gentleman there in the crowd shaking his head. Let me remind him that when Thomas Jefferson wrote that document, he was the owner, and so continued until his death, of a large number of slaves. Did he intend to say in that declaration that his Negro slaves, which he held and treated as property, were created his equals by divine law, and that he was violating the law of God every day of his life by holding them as slaves? It must be borne in mind that when that declaration was put forth, every one of the 13 colonies were slaveholding colonies, and every man who signed that instrument represented a slaveholding constituency. Recollect also that no one of them emancipated his slaves, much less put them on equality with himself, after he signed the declaration. On the contrary, they all continued to hold their Negroes as slaves during the Revolutionary War. Now, do you believe, are you willing to have it said, that every man who signed the Declaration of Independence declared the Negro his equal, and then was hypocrite enough to continue to hold them as a slave in violation of what he believed to be the divine law? And yet, when you say that the Declaration of Independence includes the Negro, you charge the signers of it with hypocrisy. I say to you frankly that, in my opinion, this government was made by our fathers on a white basis. It was made by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever, and was intended to be administered by white men in all time to come. But while I hold that under our Constitution and political system the Negro is not a citizen, cannot be a citizen, and ought not to be a citizen, it does not follow by any means that he should be a slave. On the contrary, it does follow that the Negro, as an inferior race, ought to possess every right, every privilege, every immunity which he can safely exercise, consistent with the safety of the society in which he lives. Humanity requires, and Christianity commands, that you shall extend to every inferior being and every dependent being all the privileges, immunities, and advantages which can be granted to them, consistent with the safety of society. If you ask me the nature and extent of these privileges, I answer that that is a question which the people of each state must decide for themselves. Illinois has decided that question for herself. We have said that in this state the Negro shall not be a slave, nor shall he be a citizen. Kentucky holds a different doctrine. New York holds one different from either, and Maine one different from all. Virginia, in her policy on this question, differs in many respects from the others, and so on, until there are hardly two states whose policy is exactly alike in regard to the relation of the white man and the Negro. Nor can you reconcile them and make them alike. Each state must do as it pleases. Illinois had as much right to adopt the policy which we have on that subject as Kentucky had to adopt a different policy. The great principle of this government is that each state has the right to do as it pleases on all these questions, and no other state or power on earth has the right to interfere with us or complain of us merely because our system differs from theirs. In the compromise measures of 1850, Mr. Clay declared that this great principle ought to exist in the territories as well as in the states, and I reasserted his doctrine in the Kansas and Nebraska bill in 1854. But Mr. Lincoln cannot be made to understand, and those who are determined to vote for him, no matter whether he is a pro-slavery man in the South and a Negro equality advocate in the North, cannot be made to understand how it is that in a territory the people can do as they please on the slavery question under the Dred Scott decision. Let us see whether I cannot explain it to the satisfaction of all impartial men. Chief Justice Taney has said in his opinion in the Dred Scott case that a Negro slave being property stands on an equal footing with other property, and that the owner may carry them into United States territory the same as he does other property. Suppose any two of you, neighbors, should conclude to go to Kansas, one carrying $100,000 worth of Negro slaves and the other $100,000 worth of mixed merchandise, including quantities of liquor. You both agree that under that decision you may carry your property to Kansas. But when you get there, the merchant who is possessed of the liquors is met by the Maine liquor law, which prohibits the sale or use of his property, and the owner of the slaves is met by equally unfriendly legislation, which makes his property worthless after he gets it there. What is the right to carry your property into the territory worth to either when unfriendly legislation in the territory renders it worthless after you get it there? The slaveholder, when he gets his slaves there, finds that there is no local law to protect him in holding them, no slave code, no police regulation maintaining and supporting him in his right, and he discovers at once that the absence of such friendly legislation excludes his property from the territory, just as irresistibly as if there was a positive constitutional prohibition excluding it. Thus, you find it is with any kind of property in a territory, it depends for its protection on the local and municipal law. If the people of a territory want slavery, they make friendly legislation to introduce it. But if they do not want it, they withhold all protection from it, and then it cannot exist there. Such was the view taken on the subject by different Southern men when the Nebraska bill passed. See the speech of Mr. Orr of South Carolina, the present Speaker of the House of Representatives of Congress, made at that time, and there you will find this whole doctrine argued out at full length. Read the speeches of other Southern congressmen, senators, and representatives made in 1854, and you will find that they took the same view of the subject as Mr. Orr, that slavery could never be forced on a people who did not want it. I hold that in this country there is no power on the face of the globe that can force any institution on an unwilling people. The great fundamental principle of our government is that the people of each state and each territory shall be left perfectly free to decide for themselves what shall be the nature and character of their institutions. When this government was made, it was based on that principle. At the time of its formation, there were 12 slaveholding states and 1 free state in this union. Suppose this doctrine of Mr. Lincoln and the Republicans of uniformity of laws of all the states on the subject of slavery had prevailed. Suppose Mr. Lincoln himself had been a member of the convention which framed the Constitution, and that he had risen in that august body, and addressing the father of his country, had said as he did at Springfield, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." What do you think would have been the result? Suppose he had made that convention believe that doctrine, and they had acted upon it. What do you think would have been the result? Do you believe that the one free state would have outvoted the 12 slaveholding states and thus abolished slavery? On the contrary, would not the 12 slaveholding states have outvoted the one free state, and under his doctrine have fastened slavery by an irrevocable constitutional provision upon every inch of the American Republic? Thus you see that the doctrine he now advocates, if proclaimed at the beginning of the government, would have established slavery everywhere throughout the American continent. And are you willing, now that we have the majority section, to exercise a power which we never would have submitted to when we were in the minority? If the Southern states had attempted to control our institutions and make the states all slave when they had the power, I ask, would you have submitted to it? If you would not, are you willing, now that we have become the strongest under that great principle of self-government that allows each state to do as it pleases, to attempt to control the Southern institutions? Then, my friends, I say to you that there is but one path of peace in this republic, and that is to administer this government as our fathers made it, divided into free and slave states, allowing each state to decide for itself whether it wants slavery or not. If Illinois will settle the slavery question for herself and mind her own business and let her neighbors alone, we will be at peace with Kentucky and every other Southern state. If every other state in the Union will do the same, there will be peace between the North and the South, and in the whole Union. So here now is Mr. Lincoln's reply. He says this: the judge, referring to Stephen Douglas, the judge has alluded to the Declaration of Independence and insisted that Negroes are not included in that declaration, and that it is a slander upon the framers of that instrument to suppose that Negroes were meant therein. And he asks you, is it possible to believe that Mr. Jefferson, who penned the immortal paper, could have supposed himself in applying the language of that instrument to the Negro race, and yet held a portion of that race in slavery? Would he not at once have freed them? I only have to remark upon this part of the judge's speech, and that too very briefly, for I shall not detain myself or you upon that point for any great length of time, that I believe the entire records of the world from the date of the Declaration of Independence up to within 3 years ago may be searched in vain for one single affirmation from one single man that the Negro was not included in the Declaration of Independence. I think I may defy Judge Douglas to show that he ever said so, that Washington ever said so, that any president ever said so, that any member of Congress ever said so, or that any living man upon the whole earth ever said so until the necessities of the present policy of the Democratic Party in regard to slavery had to invent that affirmation. And I will remind Judge Douglas and this audience that while Mr. Jefferson was the owner of slaves, as undoubtedly he was, in speaking upon this very subject, he used the strong language that, quote, he trembled for his country when he remembered that God was just. And I will offer the highest premium in my power to Judge Douglas if he will show that he, in all his life, ever uttered a sentiment at all akin to that of Jefferson. Now, a few words in regard to these extracts from speeches of mine, which Judge Douglas has read to you, and which he supposes are in very great contrast to each other. Those speeches have been before the public for a considerable time, and if they have any inconsistency in them, if there is any conflict in them, the public have been able to detect it. When the judge says, in speaking on this subject, that I make speeches of one sort for the people of the northern end of the state and of a different sort for the southern people, he assumes that I do not understand that my speeches will be put in print and read north and south. He knew all the while that the speech that I made at Chicago, and the one I made at Jonesboro, and the one at Charleston would all be put in print, and all the reading and intelligent men in the community would see them and know all about my opinions. And I have not supposed, and do not now suppose, that there is any conflict whatever between them. But the judge will have it that if we do not confess that there is a sort of inequality between the white and black races, which justifies us in making them slaves, we must then insist that there is a degree of equality that requires us to make them our wives. Now, I have all the while taken a broad distinction in regard to that matter, and that is all there is in these different speeches which he arrays here. And the entire reading of either of the speeches will show that that distinction was made. Perhaps by taking two parts of the same speech, he could have got up as much of a conflict as the one he has found. I have all the while maintained that, in so far as it should be insisted that there was an equality between the white and black races that should produce a perfect social and political equality, it was an impossibility. This you have seen in my printed speeches, and with it I have said that in their right to, quote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as proclaimed in that old declaration, the inferior races are our equals. And these declarations I have constantly made in reference to the abstract moral question to contemplate and consider when we are legislating about any new country, which is not already cursed with the actual presence of the evil, slavery. I have never manifested any impatience with the necessities that spring from the actual existence of slavery amongst us where it does already exist. But I have insisted that, in legislating for new countries where it does not exist, there is no just rule other than that of moral and abstract right. With reference to those new countries, those maxims as to the right of a people to, quote, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, were the just rules to be constantly referred to. There is no misunderstanding this except by men interested to misunderstand it. I take it that I have to address an intelligent and reading community who will peruse what I say, weigh it, and then judge whether I advance improper or unsound views, or whether I advance hypocritical and deceptive and contrary views in different portions of the country. I believe myself to be guilty of no such thing as the latter, though of course I cannot claim that I am entirely free from all error in the opinions I advance. The judge has also detained us a while in regard to the distinction between his party and our party. His he assumes to be a national party, ours a sectional one. He does this in asking the question whether this country has any interest in the maintenance of the Republican Party. He assumes that our party is altogether sectional, that the party to which he adheres is national, and the argument is that no party can be a rightful party, can be based upon rightful principles, unless it can announce its principles everywhere. I presume that Judge Douglas could not go into Russia and announce the doctrine of our national democracy. He could not denounce the doctrine of kings and emperors and monarchies in Russia. And it may be true of this country that in some places we may not be able to proclaim a doctrine as clearly true as the truth of democracy, because there is a section so directly opposed to it that they will not tolerate us in doing so. Is it the true test of the soundness of a doctrine that in some places people won't let you proclaim it? Is that the way to test the truth of any doctrine? Why, I understood that one time the people of Chicago would not let Judge Douglas preach a certain favorite doctrine of his. I commend to his consideration the question whether he takes that as a test of the unsoundness of what he wanted to preach. We have a Republican state platform laid down in Springfield in June last, stating our position all the way through on the questions before the country. We are now far advanced in this canvass. Judge Douglas and I have made perhaps 40 speeches apiece, and we have now for the 5th time met face-to-face in debate, and up to this day I have not found either Judge Douglas or any friend of his taking hold of the Republican platform or laying his finger upon anything in it that is wrong. I ask you all to recollect that. Judge Douglas turns away from the platform principles to the fact that he can find people somewhere who will not allow us to announce those principles. If he had great confidence that our principles were wrong, he would take hold of them and demonstrate them to be wrong. But he does not do so. The only evidence that he has of their being wrong is in the fact that there are people who won't allow us to preach them. I ask again, is that the way to test the soundness of a doctrine? I ask his attention also to the fact that by the rule of nationality he is himself fast becoming sectional. I ask his attention to the fact that his speeches would not go as current now south of the Ohio River as they have formerly gone there. I ask his attention to the fact that he felicitates himself today that all the Democrats of the free states are agreeing with him, while he omits to tell us that the Democrats of any slave state agree with him. If he has not thought of this, I commend to his consideration the evidence in his own declaration on this day of his becoming sectional too. I see it rapidly approaching. Whatever may be the result of this ephemeral contest between Judge Douglas and myself, I see the day rapidly approaching when his pill of sectionalism, which he has been thrusting down the throats of Republicans for years past, will be crowded down his own throat. Now, in regard to what Judge Douglas said in the beginning of his speech about the Compromise of 1850 containing the principle of the Nebraska Bill, although I have often presented my views upon that subject, yet as I have not done so in this canvass, I will, if you please, detain you a little with them. I have always maintained, so far as I was able, that there was nothing of the principle of the Nebraska Bill in the Compromise of 1850 at all. Nothing whatever. Where can you find the principle of the Nebraska Bill in the Compromise? If anywhere, in the two pieces of the Compromise organizing the territories of New Mexico and Utah. It was expressly provided in these two acts that when they came to be admitted into the Union, they should be admitted with or without slavery, as they should choose by their own constitutions. Nothing was said in either of those acts as to what was to be done in relation to slavery during the territorial existence of those territories, while Henry Clay constantly made the declaration, Judge Douglas recognizing him as a leader, that in his opinion the old Mexican laws would control that question during the territorial existence, and that these old Mexican laws excluded slavery. How can that be used as a principle for declaring that during the territorial existence, as well as at the time of framing the Constitution, the people, if you please, might have slaves if they wanted them? I am not discussing the question whether it is right or wrong, but how are the New Mexican and Utah laws patterns for the Nebraska Bill? I maintain that the organization of Utah and New Mexico did not establish a general principle at all. It had no feature of establishing a general principle. The acts to which I have referred were a part of a general system of compromises. They did not lay down what was proposed as a regular policy for the territories, only an agreement in this particular case to do in that way, because other things were done that were to be a compensation for it. They were allowed to come in that shape, because in another way it was paid for, considering that as a part of that system of measures called the Compromise of 1850, which finally included half a dozen acts. It included the admission of California as a free state, which was kept out of the Union for a half a year because it had formed a free constitution. It included the settlement of the boundary of Texas, which had been undefined before, which was in itself a slavery question. For if you pushed the line farther west, you made Texas larger and made more slave territory, while if you drew the line toward the east, you narrowed the boundary and diminished the domain of slavery, and by so much increased free territory. It included the abolition of the slave trade in the District of Columbia. It included the passage of a new fugitive slave law. All these things were put together, and though passed in separate acts, were nevertheless in legislation, as the speeches at the time will show, made to depend upon each other. Each got votes with the understanding that the other measures were to pass, and by this system of compromise in that series of measures, those two bills, the New Mexico and Utah bills, were passed. And I say for that reason they could not be taken as models framed upon their own intrinsic principle for all future territories. And I have the evidence of this in the fact that Judge Douglas is year afterward, or more than a year afterward perhaps, when he first introduced bills for the purpose of framing new territories, did not attempt to follow these bills of the New Mexico and Utah. Of New Mexico and Utah, not the New Mexico and Utah. And even when he introduced this Nebraska bill, I think you will discover that he did not exactly follow them. But I do not wish to dwell at great length upon his branch of the discussion. My own opinion is that a thorough investigation will show most plainly that the New Mexico and Utah bills were part of a system of compromise and not designed as patterns for future territorial legislation, and that this Nebraska bill did not follow them as a pattern at all. While we were at Freeport, in one of those joint discussions, I answered certain interrogatories which Judge Douglas had propounded to me, and then in turn propounded some to him, which he in a sort of way answered. The third one of these interrogatories I have with me, and wish now to make some comments upon it. It was in these words, quote, "If the Supreme Court of the United States shall decide that the states cannot exclude slavery from their limits, are you in favor of acquiescing in, adhering to, and following such decision as a rule of political action?" To this interrogatory, Judge Douglas made no answer in any just sense of the word. He contented himself with sneering at the thought that it was possible for the Supreme Court ever to make such a decision. He sneered at me for propounding the interrogatory. I had not propounded it without some reflection, and I wish now to address to this audience some remarks upon it. In the second clause of the 6th article, I believe it is, of the Constitution of the United States, we find the following language, quote, This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of a land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. The essence of the Dred Scott case is compressed into the sentence which I will now read. Quote, now, as we have already said in an earlier part of this opinion upon a different point, the right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution. I repeat it, quote, the right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution. What is it to be, quote, affirmed in the Constitution? Made firm in the Constitution, so made that it cannot be separated from the Constitution without breaking the Constitution, durable as the Constitution, and part of the Constitution. Now, remembering the provision of the Constitution which I have read, affirming that that instrument is the supreme law of a land, that the judges of every state shall be bound by it, any law or constitution of any state to the contrary notwithstanding, that the right of property in a slave is affirmed in that Constitution, is made, formed into, and cannot be separated from it without breaking it, durable as the instrument, part of the instrument. What follows is a short and even syllogistic argument from it. I think it follows, and I submit to the consideration of men capable of arguing, whether as I state it in syllogistic form the argument has any fault in it. Nothing in the Constitution or laws of any state can destroy a right distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution of the United States. Excuse me. The right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution of the United States. Therefore, nothing in the Constitution or laws of any state can destroy the right of property in a slave. I believe that no fault can be pointed out in that argument. Assuming the truth of the premises, the conclusion, so far as I have capacity at all to understand it, follows inevitably. There is a fault in it, as I think, but the fault is not in the reasoning, but the falsehood, in fact, is a fault of the premises. I believe that the right of property in a slave is not distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution, and Judge Douglas thinks it is. I believe that the Supreme Court and the advocates of that decision may search in vain for the place in the Constitution where the right of a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed. I say, therefore, that I think one of the premises is not true in fact. But it is true with Judge Douglas. It is true with the Supreme Court who pronounced it. They are estopped from denying it, and being estopped from denying it, the conclusion follows that the Constitution of the United States being the supreme law, no constitution or law can interfere with it. It being affirmed in the decision that the right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution, the conclusion inevitably follows that no state law or constitution can destroy that right. I then say to Judge Douglas and to all others that I think it will take a better answer than a sneer to show that those who have said that the right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution are not prepared to show that no constitution or law can destroy that right. I propose to Judge Douglas another interrogatory, which was correlative to that, quote, are you in favor of acquiring additional territory in disregard of how it may affect us upon the slavery question? Judge Douglas answered, that is, in his own way, he answered it. I believe that although he took a good many words to answer it, it was a little more fully answered than any other. The substance of his answer was that this country would continue to expand, that it would need additional territory, that it was as absurd to suppose that we could continue upon our present territory, enlarging in population as we are, as it would be to hoop a boy 12 years of age and expect him to grow to man's size without bursting the hoops. I believe it was something like that. Consequently, he was in favor of the acquisition of further territory as fast as we might need it, in disregard of how it might affect the slavery question. I do not say this as giving his exact language, but he said so substantially. And he would leave the question of slavery where the territory was acquired to be settled by the people of the acquired territory. Someone heckled, "That's the doctrine." To which Lincoln replies, "Maybe it is. Let us consider that for a while. This will probably, in the run of things, become one of the concrete manifestations of this slavery question. If Judge Douglas's policy upon this question succeeds and gets fairly settled down until all opposition is crushed out, the next thing will be a grab for the territory of poor Mexico, an invasion of the rich lands of South America. Then the adjoining islands will follow, each one of which promises additional slave fields. and this question is to be left to the people of those countries for settlement. When we shall get Mexico, I don't know whether the judge will be in favor of the Mexican people that we get with it. Let me try that again. When we shall get Mexico, I don't know whether the judge will be in favor of the Mexican people that we get with it settling that question for themselves and all others, because we know the judge has a great horror for mongrels, and understand that the people of Mexico are most decidedly a race of mongrels. I understand that there is not more than one person there out of 8 who is pure white, and I suppose from the judge's previous declaration that when we get Mexico, or any considerable portion of it, that he will be in favor of these mongrels settling the question, which would bring him somewhat into collusion with his horror of an inferior race. It is to be remembered, though, that this power of acquiring additional territory is a power confided to the President and Senate of the United States. It is a power not under the control of the representatives of the people any further than they, the President and the Senate, can be considered the representatives of the people. Let me illustrate that by a case we have in our history. When we acquired the territory from Mexico in the Mexican War, the House of Representatives, composed of the immediate representatives of the people, all the time insisted that the territory thus to be acquired should be brought in upon condition that slavery should be forever prohibited therein, upon the terms and in the language that slavery had been prohibited from coming into this country. This was insisted upon constantly, and never failed to call forth an assurance that any territory thus acquired should have that prohibition in it, so far as the House of Representatives was concerned. But at last the President and Senate acquired the territory without asking the House of Representatives anything about it, and took it without that prohibition. They have the power of acquiring territory without the immediate representatives of the people being called upon to say anything about it, and thus furnishing a very apt and powerful means of bringing new territory into the Union, and, when it is once brought into the country, involving us anew in this slavery agitation. It is, therefore, as I think, a very important question for the consideration of the American people whether the policy of bringing in additional territory, without considering at all how it will operate upon the safety of the Union in reference to this one great disturbing element in our national politics, shall be adopted as the policy of the country. You will bear in mind that it is to be acquired, according to the judge's view, as fast as it is needed, and the indefinite part of this proposition is that we have only Judge Douglas and his class of men to decide how fast it is needed. We have no clear and certain way of determining or demonstrating how fast territory is needed by the necessities of the country. Whoever wants to go out filibustering, then, thinks that more territory is needed. Whoever wants wider slave fields, feels sure that some additional territory is needed as slave territory. Then it is as easy to show the necessity of additional slave territory as it is to assert anything that is incapable of absolute demonstration. Whatever motive a man or a set of men may have for making annexation of property or territory, it is very easy to assert, but much less easy to disprove, that it is necessary for the wants of a country. So here we'll have Mr. Douglas's reply. He says this: Mr. Lincoln asserts today, as he did at Chicago, that the Negro was included in that clause of the Declaration of Independence which says that all men were created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If the Negro was made his equal and mine, if that equality was established by divine law, and was the Negro's inalienable right, how came he to say at Charleston to the Kentuckians residing in that section of our state that the Negro was physically inferior to the white man, belonged to an inferior race, and he was for keeping him always in that inferior condition? I wish you to bear these things in mind. At Charleston, he said that the Negro belonged to an inferior race, and that he was for keeping him in that inferior condition. There he gave the people to understand that there was no moral question involved, because the inferiority being established, it was only a question of degree and not a question of right. Here, today, instead of making it a question of degree, he makes it a moral question, says that it is a great crime to hold the Negro in that inferior condition. Someone heckled, "He's right." Mr. Douglas replies, "Is he right now, or was he right in Charleston?" Someone heckled, "Both." Mr. Douglas replies, "He is right then, sir, in your estimation, not because he is not because he is consistent, but because he can trim his principles any way, in any section, so as to secure voters. All I desire of him is that he will declare the same principles in the South that he does in the North. He complains because I did not go into an argument reviewing Chief Justice Taney's opinion and the other opinions of the different judges to determine whether their reasoning is right or wrong on the questions of law. What use would that be? He wants to take an appeal from the Supreme Court to this meeting to determine whether the questions of law were decided properly. He is going to appeal from the Supreme Court of the United States to every town meeting, in the hope that he can excite a prejudice against that court, and on the wave of that prejudice ride into the Senate of the United States, when he could not get there on his own principles or his own merits. Suppose he should succeed in getting into the Senate of the United States. What then will he have to do with the decision of the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case? Can he reverse that decision when he gets there? Can he act upon it? Has the Senate any right to reverse it or revise it? He will not pretend that it has. Then why drag the matter into this contest unless for the purpose of making a false issue by which he can direct public attention from the real issue? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the fifth debate. If you have any questions about what was said in the fifth debate, maybe questions about what was said in the previous debate, or maybe there's a topic debates the previous debates, or maybe there's a topic you'd like me to cover in a future lecture, go ahead and post those down in the comments, because the entire purpose of the Calhoun School of Law is to equip you with the necessary skills and information, such as this, to combat any sort of lawfare that will be waged against you, your loved ones, or your hard-earned property. So please, if you have any questions, go ahead and post them down in the comments. Excellent. So my name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law to bring you a lot of information that plenty of bad folks would rather you not have. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and if not, while you're down in the comments, go ahead and let me know how I can do better so I can best serve that purpose of helping you. I hope you'll have a wonderful day, and until I see you on the next lecture for the next topic, I bid you all farewell.